Hello, welcome to my channel, Anglican Aesthetics. I wanted to record this video in response to Joe Hescmeyer on my morning commute here. And, you know, I won't have a lot of time this weekend to sort of make videos, so I thought I might use my time this morning to do so. What I want to cover is his recent response to my friends, Gavin, Javier, and Ben, and target what I just don't, yeah, it's just frustrating, man. Like, I don't know, I guess we'll just keep having to hammer this away. Okay, so Joe tries to defend the Canon problem, and his central argument seems to be that, well, if the Bible contains all things necessary to salvation, it seems problematic that you don't have a canon list in there. So I'm going to try to critique several points that he made in the video, and of course others can critique other points he makes. With respect to that argument, it's kind of a bizarre argument. It's sort of like saying, you know, if you get a prescription from your doctor says this prescription has everything you need on it to get well. And you say, well, except how you derived that prescription yourself, huh? Like, except how you got to the conclusion that these drugs were supposed to go on this prescription list. Okay, that would be a very interesting reply. So this is the sort of analog here that we're in. When Joe says, well, the central problem for Protestants is that they don't have a canon list, right? They don't have a way of determining what books even go on the canon. Well, the claim that the unlearned can know what is necessary to salvation applies to those who have the Bible. It's a claim that the things from Scripture, the books of Scripture, are plain enough so that the unlearned can use them to know what they need to be saved. So it's not an exhaustive claim. It's not a claim that they need everything, they can learn everything they need to know, period, for life and faith with God. It's just the very modest claim that what they need to know to be saved is clear from Scripture. And that's an empirical claim. That is, it's a claim that we can then examine and say, okay, well, are the contents of Scripture clear enough so as to give us clarity as to what you need to do to be saved? The question of how we get Scripture is a completely different question. Now, Joe might say, rightly, okay, well, how can the unlearned know what books are in Scripture, given that different denominations have different canon lists? Something to this effect. Okay. So this is where Gavin's analogy is really crucial here. Gavin drew the analogy between Moses receiving divine revelation through fallible means and nevertheless having a very high degree of confidence that he is encountering God. Now, Heschmeyer kind of bizarrely likens this to Jordan Peterson and says, well, this is kind of like talking about how Jordan Peterson is a fallible individual. Well, he is a fallible individual, and so do we want to say that, I forget the precise point, but it was something to the effect of, well, is Gavin saying Moses and Jordan Peterson are equally fallible or something like this? And of course, that wasn't the point. That wasn't the point at all. Of course, Moses and Jordan Peterson don't need to be equally fallible. In fact, Moses can be more reliable for it to be the case that neither of them are infallible, which was Gavin's point. Neither Moses nor Jordan Peterson nor anyone is infallible, and yet Moses clearly has a reliable dependence on fallible means that give him access to the infallible voice of God. And so what we'd want to say is that you can use fallible means to have a reliable confidence in the books of Scripture. Now, the way the unlearned and the learned are going to do this are different in an analogous manner to how a layman relative to medicine, like myself, right, would rely on the consensus of the medical community with respect to some medical recommendation. And I can reliably do so. And that's going to work for me. But that's going to obviously be different than how the doctor comes to that conclusion and provides that recommendation. Okay, well, what is that sort of fallible yet reliable means that the unlearned person can actually rely upon to discern what books of scripture they should be attending to? And again, this isn't to say that there aren't other books, at least at this point, at the stage of the lay person who is saying, okay, minimally, where do I find what I need to be saved, right? Even there, they don't actually need all of the books of scripture even to know what they need to be saved. That will obviously nourish their life with God. It will obviously be very vital to growth, but it's not strictly necessary. So where do they go? Well, we would say, look to the consent of the church. What is it that the churches broadly baptized Christians, validly baptized Christians through time accept as canonical? And when we do that, we find a minimal list of 66 books. Now, one might say, well, that still differs from the Roman Catholic canon. Look, everyone agrees that those 66 books, even if Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox say that there are more than 66 books, everyone agrees that there are at least 66 books. So the unlearned person can say, okay, minimally, I know these books are scripture, and so minimally, I can actually go to them and see, okay, do they tell me plainly what I need to do and believe to be saved? And we would say, yes, Romans 10, 9 through 13, we would say Acts 2, Matthew 28, I've covered this in my own video on this. I think it's like Protestants Get Wrecked or something like that with a goofy thumbnail. So we would distinguish then between ecclesial infallibility and ecclesial reliability. And ecclesial reliability looks at what the church has spoken through time across her various expressions. So it's actually kind of a more Catholic, ironically, view in that we're looking very broadly across the churches, across time, to say, okay, what are the books that are prioritized? Now, the second part of Joe's video I wanted to address was the remarkable claim that that in the sort of distinction between ecclesiastical books and proto-canonical books, that this did not delineate differing levels of authority. Again, I'm just going to link Javier's Substack post below. You can read it for yourself that this is obviously false. Namely, that Athanasius very clearly delineates the authority of those books from each other. You can see the Glossa Ordinaria distinguishing the authority of those books. You can see Cyril of Jerusalem distinguishing the authority of those books. So it's kind of it's really quite silly claim there that he makes. Hugh of St. Victor in the Middle Ages. Now, here's where I'll defend and offer the Anglican view of the sufficiency of Scripture. You can find this in the Articles of Religion and the Nature of the Apocrypha. And then I'll give, finally, kind of an overview of how we derive, again, the canonicity of each of these books, which, reminder, I plan to do in more detail in a very thorough manner, section by section, when time permits. Now, what is the Anglican doctrine of the sufficiency of Scripture? The Anglican view is that Scripture contains all that is necessary for salvation. Okay? So it's not all things that are necessary absolutely, even not all things that we're required to do. It's that Scripture contains all that is necessary for salvation. That is to say, you can read scripture and know what you need to do and believe to be saved. Okay? That's the claim. That's a very modest claim. Okay. Now, given that, what is our view of the Apocrypha, or the Deuterocanon? With John of Salisbury, with the Glossa, with Hugh of St. Victor, we would hold that the deuterocanonical books are profitable, good books, given by providence for the instruction of morals, manner of living. That is to say, you can read them for edification, you can read them for instruction in how to live, and they are reliable to that end. They should be read in the churches. In fact, they're retained in our lectionary. So we have actually a pretty high view of the Deuterocanon. We read them. We think that one can read them and learn from them, learn morally from them. And of course, we even think that you can confirm certain doctrines that are found in the proto-canon, or the Deuterocanon can add certain coloring to certain doctrines found in the proto-canon. So for instance, in Romans 1, you have the claim that the divine nature is clearly perceived in the things that have been made, and the Book of Wisdom tells us, gives a certain shading to that, right? That the perception of beauty in the creation is a proportionate sort of perception of the beauty of the Creator. We would say that's a completely legitimate use of the Apocrypha, to use the Book of Wisdom to shade how we hear certain things in the proto-canon. Okay, so how, again, do we derive then the canonicity of these books? In fact, modern scholarship, as Joe points out, will dispute the apostolicity of these books, but he can have utter confidence because the magisterium tells him so. Okay, so here's the problem. The declaration that these books belonged in the canon, whether we like it or not, whether Rome is infallible or not, depend on apostolicity. Minimally, that's a sine qua non, right? So modern scholarship thinks that Peter lied, or that the author of 2 Peter straight up lied about his identity. That's the majority opinion about 2 Peter. So, Joe can say, well, Protestants, you're subject to the conclusions of modern scholarship. But the problem is that so is he. Now, he addresses this sort of move and says, okay, well, all you're doing is undermining Christianity. The point in bringing that up is to say, look, this objection is something you also have to meet, and we're arguing that the way you meet that objection is actually going to lend support to the Protestant case. So the reason why we're like, look, to raise this objection that undermines both of our positions, at least left unanswered, and then to not answer it is dishonest. We would argue that the way you go about answering that question will lend support to either Rome or Protestantism, and we would argue the way you go about answering it is actually going to lend support to Protestantism. Because if Rome's system also depends on, for instance, the author of 2 Peter not having lied about his identity, then the methods we use to establish the canonicity of 2 Peter, which we then apply to the rest of the canon, should be equally unproblematic for the Roman apologist. Okay? In other words, if the Roman apologist wants to say, well, that's a tu quoque. You pointing out that our system relies on the author of Peter not having lied about his identity, it would collapse both of our systems. That's a tu quoque. Well, the reply is, look, presumably because you're a Roman Catholic, you have an answer to that question, and we're going to argue that any answer you give is going to either be bested or at least equivalent to the Protestant answer, which is to say, none of us are exempt from historical investigation. None of us are exempt from the arguments of modern scholarship. All of us have to deal with those arguments. It doesn't matter what you claim about the authority of your magisterium. It simply does not matter. Okay, so that's point number 2. And now, for this last part of the video, what I want to do is give another overview. I've done this before in other videos, but I'll just do this again. It just helps, I think, probably to have multiple videos covering the same sort of topic, given the way I suppose YouTube polemics works. Now, how do we get these books as canonical? There are 2 ways, 2 or 3 sort of lines of evidence that we're using to support one central principle. I've termed this principle sola apostolica, namely that the teaching of the prophets and the apostles in their integral unity are the sole authority for the church. That is to say, the teaching of the prophets and the apostles, the prophets being the authors of the Old Testament. Now, some people, as a side note, might object to me saying, oh, that's just the prophet. You're just saying prophets. Why are you doing that? Well, because prophets, you can actually see this in Luke 24. You can see this in Josephus as well. Because the word prophets is a locution for speaking about the writers of the whole Old Testament. Because all of the Old Testament was considered to have been penned by prophets. Okay. Which is distinct, of course, from the category of the major and minor prophets. Okay. Now, the teaching of the prophets and the apostles together in their unity are the sole authoritative norm. They are the sole infallible source, and indeed the supreme and ultimate source of all doctrine that the church ought to believe. The teaching of the prophets are headed towards and consummated in the teaching of the apostles, which is why I've termed this sola apostolica, to focus on the accent of the apostolic teaching. So, the question then is, where do we find the apostolic teaching written down? Where do we find it recorded? Okay, well, what we need to do then is examine our sources of apostolic teaching. That is, where do we find what the apostles taught? Now, I've found something interesting of late, as I've raised this argument, that certain Roman Catholics, and this is kind of bizarre, I wasn't really expecting this, because historically Roman Catholics agreed with this, I think, in principle, but certain Roman Catholics have said, well, don't you need a source to distinguish which teaching of the apostles which should be authoritative and binding and canonical and which ones shouldn't be? Well, no, you don't, because the apostles have a charism of infallibility, right? To do that is actually then to just lapse into what I thought was a caricature from James White. To do that actually then is just to hold to sola ecclesia, right? Like, if you need a criteria to distinguish between authoritative and non-authoritative apostolic teaching, then we're in a deep problem. And of course, that's just not, as I've documented, that's not how the early church thought about the issue at all. They thought that the apostles, in their teaching, that is to say, when they intended to teach the church, were infallible in what they taught. So then the question becomes, okay, where do we find the apostolic teaching? Where do we find this? And what we do then is try to examine which sources put to writing the apostles' teaching. So let's give a brief case for the books that we have. For the Gospel of Mark, what you'll often hear from Rome's apologists nowadays anyway, which is kind of interesting, is that, well, Mark wasn't penned by an apostle. Okay, so the question again is this book intended to put to writing the apostolic teaching? And to that we would answer resoundingly, yes, it is. It of course is. Because Mark was an interpreter of Peter. Papias tells us this. But there are also internal features of the book that indicate this as well. So, for instance, Richard Bauckham documents this in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Highly recommend it. Peter is the first disciple mentioned, the last disciple named. He's not explained, so there's an assumption. He's not sort of introduced. It's not Peter, blah, 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 blah. He's just kind of name dropped. In other words, there's an assumption that the community he's speaking to already knows who Peter is. Second, we know that this actually has a good chance of going back to Peter, going back at least to the apostolic community, because of this sort of function of name dropping here. Different names are just dropped without explanation of who they are. Well, why would you do that? You would do that only if the community you're talking to knew who you were talking about. For instance, Joanna, name dropped. Salome, name dropped. The community that Mark is written to knows who Mark is talking about. Secondly, Mark is remembered as the interpreter of Peter in the wake of the gospel writings. We find this throughout church history. And then third, if you're going to make up a gospel, right? Make up a gospel author, you wouldn't pick Mark, you'd pick Peter. And in fact, this is what happened with a lot of false gospels. You pick names that are going to garner authority. And yet the author of the Gospel of Mark picks Mark. Like you wouldn't do that unless the community actually remembered receiving this from Mark. Okay, well, what about Matthew? Well, of course, Matthew was a disciple, but doesn't Papias tell us that the Gospel of Matthew was written in the Hebrew tongue, and yet we have no evidence of that in the Gospel of Matthew itself? It doesn't look like a translation, ergo, wasn't Papias wrong? That's often actually the argument you get from scholarship here. And I've always found this kind of a bizarre argument. If you had an original written in Hebrew, right, by Matthew, and then some father later makes a Greek version, that doesn't need to be a translation to be a Greek version of what Matthew wrote, whatever he wrote, then it's still sourced in Matthew. Like what's intending to be done there is obviously the inscripturation of what Matthew taught, right? Luke was an eyewitness, traveling companion of Paul, of the apostles, clearly is interviewing them. We have random verses where he seems to indicate his source. Like, for example, Mary treasured these things up in her heart, right? That's just kind of said, and it doesn't advance the narrative in any way. And of course, we know Luke is around with the apostles, and the purpose of the gospel is to give confidence to Theophilus concerning the things he's been taught. In other words, concerning the things that the apostles were teaching. And Luke, again, as a traveling companion, is then trying to buttress this and fix the form of what's being taught. John, again, considered an apostle, pretty easy to understand why that was canonized pretty quickly. And its use across different regions gives us good confidence, I think, that it goes back to John. Okay, now the Pauline epistles, pretty obvious, Paul's an apostle. Now, what about, and of course, actually, you with this criteria of apostolicity, you get all of the books of the New Testament in principle. That is, if they are written by apostles, then you get Revelation, you get Jude, you get 2nd and 3rd John, and 1st and 2nd Peter, etc. You get everything but Hebrews, and I'll return to Hebrews in a second here. But what about the fact that scholars dispute whether Peter wrote 2nd Peter or Paul wrote the pastoral epistles? Again, that would be a problem for all. That's the frustrating thing about this, and the reason we're objecting to this, right, is because Roman Catholics are raising this as a problem for Protestants that Rome does not have. So they're using this argument to raise the credibility of Rome over Protestantism. And we're objecting to that use of this sort of argument. Now, if you're asking that question, just genuinely wanting to know the answer to that, when we reply, look, Rome, you're not exempt from that. This applies to you too. And so the way you Rome, resolve this issue is actually going to be either trumped by the Protestant approach or equivalent to the Protestant approach. Now, if Rome's appeal is, well, the infallible declaration at Trent, though, that's what makes it canonical. Okay, then the implication seems to be that you can know that it was apostolic. If we agree that if the authors lied about their authorship, then it shouldn't be apostolic. Then what essentially the Roman apologist is saying is that, well, Trent's infallible dogmatization of this letter as canonical gives us a kind of infallible ground to know it's apostolic. What we say is, okay, you don't need infallibility actually in all, in practice. You just don't. The consent of the church through time is reliable and gives you a reliable grounds to think it was apostolic. Now, the Roman Catholic might retort, well, but infallibility, that's a higher level of confidence. But then this is where Gavin's analogy with Moses comes into play. We would say, so what? That's not a problem for the Protestant approach, unless you're sort of demanding Cartesian certainty about these issues. Moses can rely on fallible means that are nevertheless reliable means to have strong confidence. Similarly, we can rely on what the church has taught and said and used through time to have reliable confidence that these books are divine, that they're apostolic. Well, but that doesn't get you infallibility. Okay, yeah, guess what? You don't have infallible certainty that you're not a brain in a vat, right? You don't need a Cartesian certainty about these issues to have everything you need to have a firm and rational and actually even warranted confidence that these books are apostolic. Okay. Now, finally, what do we do with the book of Hebrews? There are a couple of lines of evidence I want to suggest that point to the fact that Hebrews is intending to inscripturate the apostolic teaching. And at least that this is how it was remembered and received by the community. First, it was written before AD 70. The mention of ongoing sacrifices is relevant. It speaks of those as ongoing, and it would be exceptionally odd to not mention the destruction of the temple, given how this would be an obvious confirmation of the argument that the temple sacrifices are obsolete, right? Like, that would be a huge boon to the author of the Epistle to the Hebrews. Now, that itself does not prove that the letter was intended to be apostolic. You have other writings that were probably written before AD 70 as well, the Didache, that Shepherd of Hermas that aren't. Okay, but that's one line of evidence that places Hebrews within the apostolic community. But then, Hebrews, at the end of the chapter, has an association with Timothy. That is to say, the author of Hebrews seems to be an associate of Bishop Timothy, discipled by St. Paul. And the letter, we learn from the end of Hebrews, was delivered by the Church of Rome. The reason that's significant is because the community then that receives the letter is probably told by the letter carrier how and what the letter is intended to do, what it's intended to be. So there's at least a plausible origin of a memory of what this letter is supposed to do and be in the community. Third line of evidence that it puts to writing the apostolic teaching. It seemed the most common attribution of the letter in church history seemed to have been to St. Paul, although that's unlikely, and there are a lot of there are several fathers that mention that that's unlikely as well. The style is just very radically different. It reads like a completely different author. In theory, could it have been Paul? Maybe, but it's just there. It doesn't have any of the standard features the other Pauline epistles have, like the greeting at the beginning, like grammar used throughout, like the nature of Paul's Greek, which, while educated, is not nearly as stylized and complex as the letter to the Hebrews. I mean, the letter to the Hebrews is like a literary masterpiece. It really is. It's a very elegant letter. But that attribution to St. Paul actually is still valuable, because it tells us that the letter was remembered as having apostolic force. That is to say, it was remembered as putting to writing the apostolic teaching. And Hebrews 6 then also seems to give us indications in the letter that it's intending to convey apostolic teaching. Let us not return to the elementary doctrine of the laying on of hands, the resurrection, blah, 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 but let us move on to solid food. So it seems to be wanting to go further, right? To deliver more positive doctrine. Not just expositing, but to deliver more positive doctrine. Now, those features together distinguish it from something like Clement, which is very clearly expositing. It's a sermon. Clement is not intending to put to writing what the apostles taught, but rather is just intending, he's giving a sermon, essentially. Now, the Didache does purport this, but the problem is both its dubious origin and the fact that it doesn't show any sort of internal features that would trace it or place it to the apostles. No one could confirm its origin, similar to the Shepherd of Hermas. Now, what do you do with the disputed epistles? The question again is of apostolicity there. And if Rome wants to say, well, our dogmatization at Trent can mean that historically it was penned by an apostle, we would say, okay. We would say all you need for the authority of the church to function as an evidential peg for the apostolic origin of these letters is ecclesial reliability. You don't need ecclesial infallibility, and therefore it's not doing any positive work besides giving us a kind of alleged Cartesian certainty that we actually don't really need or use in any other area of life. Ecclesial reliability does the job just fine. So that's sort of an overview of a rebuttal to the most recent video. Go ahead and let me know what you think. Let me know what I may have missed. I'll go ahead and link Javier's Substack below. Thank you so much for watching. God bless.